Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Tough show today, inevitably, because we're dealing with observable evidence, we're dealing with actual reality, which I realise more and more as these weeks pass and these strange polls come in talking about, some bigging up journalism, others, notably one published by Sky News, which I suppose makes it TV journalism, doesn't it, reporting that faith in TV journalism has gone into decline, and indeed newspaper journalism, and I'm sure radio journalism if they'd bothered to ask. But it's increasingly clear, of course, that the huge swathes of the media that have been indulging in utterly slavish support of both Boris Johnson and previously Brexit. I don't think you can separate the two, can you? We can at least all agree about that. It's boiled our brains. We've forgotten what proper journalism looks like. The front page of a Daily Mail that's critical of a Conservative government. I mean, what is this rabbit hole down which we've fallen? Piers Morgan on Good Morning Britain every day, holding government ministers to account, having spent the last couple of years effectively saying that we need to support them even though they're lying through their teeth. I'm sure he'd object to that representation, so I should probably acknowledge that immediately. And now, of course, proving to be one of the government's most ardent scrutineers, people can't process it. So they think that they're being let down. Hang on a minute, they say to the editors of some newspapers and indeed some broadcasters, you've been utterly slavish in your support of Boris Johnson for the last God knows how many months and years. Hang on a minute, you've been feeding us nonsense about the European Union. Why are you now suddenly actually shining a light into some darker corners of this government's performance? It's absolutely outrageous. And it leads inevitably, I think, to people in the industry now beginning to suggest, and I've seen it in the strangest of places, now beginning to suggest that we should all stop asking questions, which would be great if this was North Korea, but it's not. So we have to, and we have done, and among the answers we've received is one that was, I think, utterly and completely confirmed by last night's Panorama on the BBC. The NHS was spectacularly ill-equipped to cope with this crisis. We know that because doctors rang up and told us. But can I run something by you? You know how much I enjoy, 90% of the time, how much I enjoy being on Twitter in particular, but it's like an extension of being a phone-in host, except you have a little bit less power, I suppose, on Twitter than you do when you're a phone-in host. But it means you constantly get the chance to see where other people are coming from. And one of the most interesting things I've seen in the last few weeks, and I hope this is as interesting to you as it is to me, I think it will be, was when we were taking calls from doctor after doctor after doctor, nurse after nurse after nurse, carer after carer after carer, paramedic after paramedic after paramedic, telling us about shortages, telling us about gowns, telling us about visors, telling us about swabs, telling us about body bags, telling us about pretty much every item of so-called personal protective equipment being in short supply. Something really strange emerged. I don't think it popped up on air. My apologies if it did. In a minute I shall allow myself a brief boast, if that's the right word, about something that indeed did pop up on air and got, as a joke, in fact. I think I made it as a joke and it turned out to be true. But we were taking all those calls, and I saw some tweets, I don't think we took a call on this, suggesting that in order to balance the story, we needed to talk to medics who did have enough equipment. You remember there was that Conservative MP whose name escapes me, who tweeted a picture, and I'm very, very reluctant to criticise her unduly, because she had literally just finished a shift as a nurse in an NHS hospital, but she tweeted a picture of herself wearing a mask with the line in it, plenty, or something very close to, plenty of PPE, despite media reports. Now, if you are mad enough or kind enough to listen to this programme on a regular basis, you'll know that I have something of an obsession with skeleton keys and Rosetta Stones, penny drop moments. And it took me a while, even though I spoke to you about that MP, at the time, it took me a while to work out why I thought that was so significant. And I realised why I thought that was so significant. when I started seeing this line of argument emerging. And it's a really frightening line of argument. The idea that if you're having a conversation about shortages, you also need to include people that haven't suffered from shortages is about as close to bogus as I can currently conceive. And these were not mad people. These were not accounts with 16 numbers in their name and a picture of a dog or the flag of St. George as their avatar. These were, to all intents and purposes, real, rational and decent people. And they had ended up in this place, obviously, because the idea that Boris Johnson is an almighty pudding is far too huge a concept for them to grasp, because he's become the embodiment of their last two votes in the referendum and in the general election. So you just can't go there yet. And because you just can't go there yet, you search, you desperately seek something that you can wave like a little flag when presented with reality. And the reality was, and probably will be, immense shortages of personal protective equipment for the people that, well, I think those claps on Thursday night, although they're valuable and they make us all feel better, they ring increasingly hollow, don't they, when you learn more and more and more about how profoundly these people have been let down by our political masters. But you need a little flag. So reality says shortages, tribalism, even, I'm afraid, cultishness says, oh, some people have got a gown. Why don't you mention that to balance out the story? Which is, I mean, surely, once you've thought about it, we can all agree, utterly absurd. The only circumstances in which people who have got enough equipment would become part of a balanced debate would be if people were claiming that there wasn't any. Do you see what I mean? If I came on the radio and said, it's absolutely awful, there is not a single gown in Britain, there is not a single visor in Britain, there is not a single surgical face mask in Britain, then you would quite rightly queue up to call me from theatres and from hospitals and surgeries to say to me, well, I've got one, James, you're talking utter twaddle. But if I say, via you as a doctor or a nurse, there is a shortage of masks, there is no room in that debate for somebody to come in and say, well, I've got one. It would be, you know, just think about it for a moment. It would be a bit like standing up and saying, well, there's a lot of poor people over there. There's a lot of people over there who haven't got any money. And then a rich bloke stands up and says, well, I've got plenty of money. You must be talking nonsense. Do you see? And the reason I'm labouring the point slightly is precisely because of the respect I have for some of the people that were making this point or this supposed point in the context of social media. There is a massive shortage of X. Okay, loads and loads of people have not got enough X. Oh, well, here's a bloke that's got enough X. That means that they must be lying, or they must be exaggerating, or they must be cancelled out by the fact that a doctor over there does have everything he needs. And that's why, her name will come to me in a moment if it hasn't already been tweeted to me. That's why that MP who just finished a shift in a NHS hospital as a nurse troubled me so deeply, because not only when she added that little line, despite media reports, was she handing out these pathetic, fraudulent little flags that you're supposed to wave when presented with evidence of shortages. Somebody having something is not relevant to the question of whether somebody else has it. And so she's handing out these pathetic, fraudulent little flags, and decent people are picking them up and waving them. And this isn't like Brexit. This is life and death. This is doctors and nurses on the front line who we spend a minute every Thursday night apparently worshipping, being sent to war without the weapons that they need. And so that little line, despite media reports, that's why it troubled me so much. And I didn't realise until this morning when I read reports of last night's Panorama, I finally understood why that was such an obnoxious intervention. Because the way they sought to address reports of shortages was by saying some people don't have any shortages. And if that doesn't chill you to your core, then Well, nothing will, because it means that even now, even in the face of a death toll, which is estimated now to be around the 44,000 mark, the excess deaths linked to COVID-19, once you include non-hospital deaths, the best available estimates, the Financial Times is doing sterling work on this, are now up to 44,000. We are poised to become one of the worst, if not the worst, certainly probably the worst in Europe, one of the very worst in the world. We've got a Prime Minister trying to describe elements of it as an apparent success, and we've got a political movement, a rhetorical attempt to claim that because a doctor over there has got a visor, then the doctor over there who hasn't got a visor should somehow be ignored or even insulted. And that's where we are. And that, I'm afraid, is why some people now are getting increasingly desperate in their calls for criticism and scrutiny of this government to be somehow stopped. These occasionally well-meaning, but generally quite North Korean calls for journalists to stop doing journalism because the public has actually forgotten what it looks like. If you had been on for the last 3.5, 4 years, an unleavened diet of Daily Telegraph, Daily Express, Daily Mail, Sunday Times inspired, what's the word I'm looking for, because it's not reporting, propagandizing, then you will not know what day it is at the moment, because the truth is beginning to emerge about these people and about their politics and about this project. But we've spent so long down the rabbit hole, we've forgotten what daylight looks like. Let me confine today's first conversation to this question of PPE. Panorama reported last night that the failure to collect stocks went back a decade. Even as recently as June, they were warned last June that they needed gowns. Guess how many they went out and bought as a direct result of that intervention? Yeah, you're right. Absolutely zilch. Staff still say that they're being put at risk because of the shortage of personal protective equipment. And the Daily Mail, the newspaper which under its last editor essentially became a cheerleader for attacks on judges, for attacks on parliamentary democracy, for attacks on academia, for attacks on scrutiny and criticism. They report today, under their newish editor, Doctors' PPE desperation. Desperation. The Health Secretary being interviewed today on Nick's show and elsewhere, essentially still trying to spin and deny what doctors are telling us. And if you think I'm exaggerating when I tell you that if they see an opportunity to try to blame the doctors and nurses currently risking their lives for the failures of political leadership, if you think that these people, both in politics and in parts of the media, wouldn't turn on doctors and nurses as viciously and as vilely as they turn on unemployed people, foreign people, Muslims, firefighters, if you think they wouldn't try to pin this debacle on the doctors and nurses straining every sinew to get us through it with a minimum number of casualties, then you, I'm afraid, have forgotten what happened during the last doctor's strike. It's 10:17. Give me a call. Tell me how PPE is going. Tell me how much you've got. Tell me whether you're still worried. And tell me why you think the situation was so bad at the beginning of this national pandemic. It's 10:17. I'm James O'Brien. The number you need is 0345 6060 973.
Perhaps one of the most controversial aspects of the government's handling of the coronavirus crisis has been the shortage of vital protective equipment, such as gowns and masks for health and care workers. An investigation by BBC Panorama has found that the government was warned that protective kit was missing from the stockpile of such equipment last year. Ministers have acknowledged a problem and have blamed logistical issues. Richard Bilton reports.
Pandemics are not unexpected. The government has been preparing for years.
Pandemic flu is very infectious and may make a large number of people ill, and some people will die.
This public information film is from 2006.
Wash your hands thoroughly and often.
The government says COVID-19 is a different disease with higher hospitalisation rates, but the advice and the PPE needed by staff are very similar. And to deal with it, you need a stockpile, a store of kit that's ready to use straight away. The UK has one, and it's distributed from warehouses like this one in Derbyshire. But there's a problem with what's been bought. Panorama has discovered that just last year, the government's own advisers warned that gowns were needed in the stockpile, but still none were bought. John Ashton is a former regional director of public health and a critic of the government.
There's no excuse for not having adequate stockpiles. You need everything to protect against this kind of virus. It's breathtaking that there were no gowns at all in stock. Breathtaking.
The government didn't buy any visors at all. There were no swabs either, which makes testing for the virus more difficult. And the government didn't buy a single body bag, despite the fact they were supposed to be preparing for a pandemic.
For weeks, the government has been dealing with criticism about stocks of PPE. It says it's delivered 1 billion items. But government is counting items you might not think of as PPE, such as cleaning equipment, waste bags, detergent and paper towels. More than half the items are surgical gloves, and in most cases, each individual glove is counted rather than pairs. The second biggest item is plastic aprons that offer limited protection. When I spoke to Dr. Asif, there were only 4 gowns left in his A&E department, so he had to use an apron.
There's certainly not a shortage of jeans, but this is what you'd expect a dinner lady to wear. Looks like a penny. It's plastic. This is flimsy. You open it up like this. You put it on your neck like this, and then there you go. There's nothing.
The government says it's been working day and night to battle against coronavirus and to protect our NHS and save lives. That effort would have been easier if the basics had been in the stockpile. Richard Bilton, BBC News.
So it was simply true. The PPE shortage was both scandalous and enormous. How do they know? How many times have I said to you, that's not an opinion, that is counting. So, is it getting better? And why do you think it was so bad in the first place? I know that many NHS staff, both on the front line and in the offices dealing with procurement and things like that, felt compelled to talk to Panorama anonymously last night. They're still frightened. I'm not even sure what you're frightened of. I know that the managements have, in many cases, issued warnings that any political comments could be punishable. But counting isn't a political comment. It's simply a number. It's simply a number. And our friend Professor John Ashton, the public health expert, who not long ago people were queuing up to criticise and malign in all manner of ways, has once again been proved right about this. And as he told the programme last night, the consequence of not planning, not ordering kit, not having stockpiles is that we are sending into the front line doctors, nurses, other health workers and social care workers without the equipment to keep them safe. And as I mentioned to you a moment ago, I didn't see the programme. I'm very troubled by the absence of promotion and the failure of the BBC to shout this from the rooftops. I worry that they've been cowed by Dominic Cummings' repeated threats and warnings about their future. But at least they got the programme out. I missed it. I wonder if you could explain the significance of March the 19th to me. It's already significant for one reason, you know. I should probably apologise in advance. You can tell I've got the bit between my teeth this morning. So if you have rung in, I promise I'll be with you imminently. But just let me clear the pipes, okay, before we turn over the phone lines to you. March the 19th is already significant for one reason. It was the day that Matt Hancock let the cat out of the bag on Question Time about our failure to join the EU-wide procurement scheme. That was, at the time, the Downing-Tufton Street spin machine was trying to claim that we'd failed to join it because we hadn't been checking our emails or it had gone into the spam folder. Matt Hancock revealed on March the 19th on Question Time that he knew all about it and thought we should join it. That got glossed over. The Pravda elements of the British media just pretend that never happened. And the government, of course, is delighted to see them do so. Is it March the 19th also significant because of this supposed or reported, and again I'm really asking for guidance on this because I've seen some of it this morning, and I've seen again Piers Morgan on Good Morning Britain raising it with a government minister. But is it the case, as I am reading that coronavirus was somehow downgraded on the 19th of March in order to remove any legal obligation to give healthcare workers the right PPE kit. Forgive me for employing the vocabulary of Mystery Hour on a Tuesday, but I'd really like to go definitive on that. I don't think we'll be giving out Ray Liotta's or rounds of applause, although you never know. But I want to go definitive on this. Is March the 19th as significant as some of the reports I'm seeing suggests? We already know it was significant because of the Hancock contradiction of the Downing-Tufton Street line. I want to know whether it is also significant, the 19th of March, in the context of downgrading legal obligations, healthcare workers and PPE kit. Forgive me, please, in advance if I'm barking up the wrong tree on that one. I will reveal that I am and admit and concede and confess that I am as and when you give me the evidence or the answers that I need. Let's go just up the road from where I'm speaking, but a little bit further from HQ in Leicester Square. Let's go to Hammersmith, where Prashant is. Prashant, what can you tell us? Why did you pick up the phone?
Hi, James. I rang to talk about PPE, but actually I do want to just address the thing that you were just talking about, downgrades.
Yes.
So I have to, my disclaimer is that I'm a junior worker, junior doctor. I work in COVID ICU at the moment, but just about the coronavirus being downgraded, as much as I'm always sceptical of the government as well, and I understand where you're coming from, I think that, and I'm not in public health myself, but I think the justification for that was actually in terms of the mortality rate if you get it.
Yes.
It's not as high as it would need to be for it to be described as at the level that they were talking about.
Okay, so it's almost a mathematical calculation, and the downgrading is directly linked to the death rate.
So COVID has a very high death rate because it's so contagious, and so the overall numbers of people who get critically unwell and then die is very high.
I think I understand. So it was downgraded on the 19th of March, but not, in your view, in order to dilute the PPE requirements.
Yeah, there's very much that I'm sceptical about on the PPE front. But
cool. I'm relieved.
That's one
I'm
of the
relieved.
Alarm bells, and please don't stop trying to get definitive clarity on that. But that downgrade wasn't something that made me.
I didn't send an alarm bell for you. Would it, though, have perhaps coincidentally have entailed a dilution of the requirements for PPE?
So that is actually a point that I did want to talk about. And the thing that I wanted to address is, so I currently work in ITU, and I have PPE that would meet the government, NHS England and Public Health England's current requirements, and that I get a plastic gown, which obviously is not as efficient as having a full-length surgical gown. Obviously that leaves parts of my scrubs exposed in an environment where we're aerosoling with patients with coronavirus. And
that seems obvious even to me, you know.
And listening to Matt Hancock earlier on, talking to Nick Ferrari, there's a crucial point that he didn't seem to understand. Whenever he says, I'm just going by my medical and scientific advice, he doesn't seem to understand that when advisors to the government, medical professionals and scientists who work for the government have to provide government advice, they have to give that advice in the context of what resources are available. There's no point in them saying, this is what you should do in a situation where that can't be acted upon. So in a situation where the government can't provide us enough surgical gowns, they have to say, well, now as a last resort, this is what will have to be acceptable.
Well, I'm getting confused now because I think you're now slightly contradicting what you said before.
So I think that the downgrade is a separate issue. In terms of, do you mean in terms of the PPE requirements?
Well, no. Here's the line, okay? On the 19th of March, the UK downgraded COVID-19 from HCID, which is the high consequence of infectious disease category, which requires a very high level of PPE legally for healthcare workers. Yeah. It was downgraded. Now, Piers on the telly this morning was understandably haranguing a minister for safeguarding, saying, I just want to know why. Your answer is, actually, it's more complicated than that. The downgrading may not be a scandal or a big deal or even a cynical political move. It may have been an inevitable calculation, but we're still unhappy with the level of PPE that we've got.
I'm still unhappy with the level of PPE, and I think regardless of how you class what label you want to attach to this disease. Our PPE situation is not good enough. And I think for other reasons, they're trying to, Matt Hancock will say, well, it's fine that that they're using plastical gowns or that they're having to reuse.
But it's not, is it? It's just not.
Okay, it's not okay. It's the same though as when, if we run out of the
some of your colleagues are wearing bin bags, Prashant.
Yeah, well, what I'm wearing is essentially, it may as well be a bin bag.
And you're in intensive care?
I'm in intensive care with coronavirus patients, and I don't blame the team or the hospital I work for at all, because I know that all efforts are going into trying to get the right stock, and that meets the current criteria, but obviously it leaves, a lot of your underlying clothes exposed.
Yes.
I have colleagues who have become very unwell. I have colleagues who have had to move out of their families. There are many, many people who've left their homes to move into temporary accommodation because they can't put their children, partner, parents at risk. The human cost of this on healthcare workers it's more than just those who are getting those who are getting critically unwell and those who have unfortunately passed away is the big tragedy of this. But there's a massive underlying human cost on a much larger scale of people.
Forgive me for a slightly facile simile, but it's very like throwing a rock into the pond. At the moment we're only looking at the splash that it makes, aren't we? And you're describing the ripples which are going on forever. Let me read you a line from the report last night on Panorama, and just give me straight up, someone who's going to work in intensive care in a glorified bin bag, just give me your gut shot response to this single paragraph. Are you ready? The expert committee that advises the government on pandemics, the new and emerging respiratory virus threats advisory group, NERVTAG, recommended the purchase of gowns last June. Gowns are currently one of the items in shortest supply in the UK, and they are now difficult to source because of the global shortage of PPE.
Yeah, I'm appalled, and it's not a political thing. It's a matter of competence. Having our emergency preparedness is for a viral pandemic is one of the government's foremost responsibilities, and we're in supposedly a developed country.
And I wonder if I can just run something by you before I head towards the news. When you say it's not political, what you mean is it's not party political.
It's not. Exactly. It's not. This isn't a.
Doesn't matter who's in charge. This is an absolute.
Does not matter who's
mess.
in charge. Does not matter who was the health secretary when. Surgical gowns are not ventilators or hemofiltration devices. Surgical gowns are a very simple thing.
And there are not enough of them, and they were warned last June. So
exactly.
Regardless of what colour scarf you normally wear, we should be united in our disgust. I'm cracking on only because I want to hit the headlines bang on time for once. And, well, it just gets worse and worse, doesn't it? And the more I think about it, and sometimes I don't actually focus my thoughts until I start talking to you. Yeah, like that's going to come as a surprise. But the more I think about it, the more desperate now it's beginning to look that people are screaming about journalists. The British media almost attacking itself while the government registers, and the ONS figures are out now. They're not pretty. I shall talk you through them in a minute. The government is in the process of registering one of the worst responses to the COVID-19 crisis in the world. The Prime Minister stands on the steps of Downing Street talking about our apparent success, and members of this profession are suggesting that other members of this profession should stop telling the truth, stop asking difficult questions. Do you know that minister I was just telling you about, the safeguarding minister, has appeared on television this morning and demonstrated complete ignorance of that. I'm just double-checking this, actually. I don't want to get it wrong. Complete ignorance of the Cygnus pandemic planning programme. We need to double-check that clip, actually. It's quite incredible, if that is as it's being reported, that she didn't even know what it was. Prashant, our first caller of the day, working in intensive care, wearing what can only be described as a glorified bin bag, also given us the first steer on this downgrading of COVID-19 on the 19th of March. If the reason that they did it wasn't in order to dilute the legal requirements of PPE because they knew how little they had, and Prashant not as concerned, not as worried about that as I am, then what is the reason that they did it? Because if I understood him correctly, if it is death rates, then the fact that our death rates will roughly double once we include non-hospital deaths, would that be relevant, or would it just be hospital deaths that determined what the PPE requirements were? Because it's not just in hospitals, of course, that people are dying. 10:35 is the time, and, well, with those last words of mine ringing in your ears, let's go to Carl, who's in Surrey. Carl, what would you like to say?
Hello. Just the complete opposite, really. So we've had plenty of PPE since day one. We've had absolutely none of that.
Are you in a hospital?
So I'm a manager of a specialist nursing home. So the way to kind of look at us is we're effectively like hospital wards. So we have people with tracheostomies, acquired brain injuries, CPAPs, BiPAPs, ventilators, quite high needs.
So what have you done right, do you think, that some of these hospitals, I don't want to say have done wrong, but they've been unable to do?
We've always just had stock ready for it. So regardless of anything like this happening, if we have a diarrhea and vomiting outbreak or anything similar to that, we're always going to need stuff ready to be able to go. So we've had stock of that kind of stuff lying around. The organisation I work for has been superb in sourcing it. So they've gone to different providers in both the UK and around the world. They've got it shipped over. They've had daily communications for where things are. We've not had any of those kind of squeaky bum moments really with PPE to be able to panic. The only thing we've had, same as most providers and hospitals, is lack of staff, where people have had to go off and either shield or isolate.
And to be fair to the public sector, we're trying to move mountains in the same fields that you've managed to. It couldn't have been scaled up, could it? They couldn't. You couldn't have. We couldn't have found 1 million of you or your colleagues, and somehow.
A lot of the situations we found as well is that the organisation was ordering stuff in for all of the homes, and then a lot of the stuff that was being ordered or shipped over was then being seconded to the NHS to supply them as well. So they've had that to deal with as well. So we've had to go to different providers and search around for bits rather than go to our usual people to go and do stuff. So it's been a bit of a logistical challenge, but we've managed to do it with I say some ease, but it's been a busy couple of weeks. But I think it's more the independent providers and the smaller groups that haven't got that ability that are struggling. I know from
well, it's funny, isn't it? You're caught in between, actually, if I've understood you correctly, and do correct me if I haven't. It's some healthcare trusts, even perhaps we can speak of the NHS as a homogenous entity, they would be too big to move on the sort of sixpences that you describe, and the smaller care homes would be too small. You were almost perfectly placed.
Some of the NHS trusts are obviously able to do certain things rather than just the NHS as a whole body. So although the NHS is a massive organisation, the individual trusts can go to those different providers as well. So it's not, although the government have some overview of things, the procurement for the actual individual hospitals and trusts is down to the procurement managers within those individual hospitals and settings. So although the government have a portion of this to be able to hold to account, I'd say that at least 50% of this is down to the procurement side of things of those individual trusts as to why.
Well, except that the expert committee that advises the government on pandemic recommended the purchase of gowns last June. They recommended that to the government, not to individual procurement managers.
Yeah, and then the government should pass that down to the procurement side so they're aware to have that stock level ready. So if anything does happen like this or similar, so then there's a portion of blame there to be shared. I wouldn't put it on a whole amount of either of them all.
Well, no, I'm happy not to. At the moment, I don't know, maybe I'm being a bit naive, but I presume, and again, actually, you might want to comment on this, I presume naively that procurement managers are doing the very, very best they can, but the mountain was too steep and it hit them too quickly for them to be able to do what you've managed to do, largely because you already had stockpiles and reserves in place.
Yeah, and it's trying to find those places when you've got obviously a worldwide shortage now, because it's not just the UK, it's all over.
Now it is, but last June, when the government was advised to buy lots and lots of gowns, there wasn't a worldwide shortage, which is presumably, I mean, gowns wouldn't be relevant to you, but it's why you had some kit in place in the store cupboard, and we appeared to be almost running on fumes, to use a driving analogy. Let me run this by you as well. Sorry, go on.
We still use the gowns and everything else.
Do you?
Same as any hospital. Yeah, because
and you didn't have a shortage even of gowns?
No, so we've got enough gowns, gloves, masks, visors, FFP3 masks, everything like that they're going to need to deal with the type of residents we have.
You mentioned FFP3 masks. Try this on for size. I don't know if you've seen this. In 2009, when the procurement list for the stockpile was put together, there were reportedly 33 million of these masks on the list, but only 12 million have subsequently been handed out. And this is a line in the BBC report that, I mean, it's like a dagger to the heart. The government refuses to explain where the other masks have gone.
I have no idea. I mean, they're £8 a mask, so take it where you want it. And eBay and Amazon are full of them.
Carl, I'm glad that your patients are well looked after. I hope your staffing problems are improved. But, I mean, at risk of sounding a little bit morbid, however bad it gets, it's a lot worse for people in other facilities than it is for people in yours, isn't it?
Absolutely, and some of our sister homes it's savaged. They're losing half to 75% of their home.
Good grief.
So it is
and it's still not, of course, included in the daily figures that the government releases. Look after yourself, mate. Dan's in Bicester. Dan, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. I just kind of wanted to add on to what your previous caller was saying. I've been doing a lot of research into this, both in terms of the issue of PPE and NHS procurement in general. I don't know how much detail I can say on this exact bit, but on the 17th of March, a memo went around all NHS trusts from the head echelons of the NHS, without naming names, and to quote a specific point, it says, in respect of PPE, the DHSC procurement team reports that nationally there is currently adequate national supply in line with the PHE recommended usage, and the pandemic influenza stockpile has now been released to us. So on the 17th of March, 2 days before the downgrade, the NHS was telling the entire NHS body, and that went to every NHS body in the country, that there was adequate national supply. Now, 3 days later, on the 20th...
we were already taking calls every day from doctors and nurses telling us that they didn't have enough. Crowdfunding, people, you know, and even today, I think that's going to be a very hard bar to clear for future callers. Even today, Prashant talking about working in ITU in a glorified bin bag.
It's absolutely right. And the big problem is, though, is that if that memo went out on the 17th, which I say if it did, then procurement managers, which your previous caller was talking about, NHS procurement is an absolute minefield. It's got nothing to do with the pandemic we're in, even in standard circumstances. I am on the board of a charity that works with neonatal unit, which saved our daughter's life last year, and we just tried to buy some chairs for parents to sit on, and that was a nightmare. And so,
is it linked to the old cliches about it costing 80 quid to change a light bulb because it's got to go through so many?
One of the chairs that we had to buy was £3,000, and it was a standard recliner that you could probably put in your living room for about...
Because you could only buy it from an approved supplier and yada yada bin.
And if you go onto the
outsourcing, privatisation, yada yada. Here we are.
Well, it's not necessarily about privatisation. But
it'll be a private company that you bought the chair from, won't it?
Of course, of course. But if you go onto the NHS procurement website, which anyone can access, it's not a secret at all. What they did very well, again, according to these letters, is in relation to ventilators, CPAP machines, beds, they were able to adapt very quickly because the government opened up the parameters in which people could submit their proposals. You know, we obviously...
This is where I'm getting confused. Yeah, no, I understand all of that. And I think I understand the 17th to the 19th, and I understand your concerns, and now you've told us about your daughter, I understand your interest, but I don't understand why anybody would... Well, I suppose for political reasons you would want to keep the truth slightly cloudy, wouldn't you? You'd want to keep it slightly blurred, but quite how we've ended up in a place where doctors are queuing up to tell us that they haven't got enough, and the government ministers are queuing up to tell us that they have. I mean, that's just bonkers. I can't make sense of this.
Absolutely, I agree with you, but I think that one of the big problems is that in relation to PPE specifically is that the message has been so cloudy from both senior politicians and senior officials within the NHS. Doctors don't know where to turn.
Well, and senior officials within the NHS are telling doctors to shut up and sit down as well, which adds an even more troubling level, perhaps, scrutiny and accountability.
Through people I know who are working on the front line, that one major hospital in general that currently has about 400 COVID patients, they have 4,000 gowns available. But because the current guidelines say that you can't remove your gown over your head because of the mask, they're not available. Now, all it would take is a small bit of Velcro or a small popper button to enable that to be popped over your neck so you can keep your mask on.
Well, neither of us know that for sure. It's an interesting contribution, but I don't think either of us have got the qualifications to state with certainty that is the case. And indeed, that might well be part of the problem, is that you could be 100% right, but the processes that we'd have to go through, understandably, because, in the same way that you don't want to buy containers full of dodgy gear from the other side of the world because you've purchased it in desperation, you wouldn't want, I don't think, to abandon some of the, well, how can you say that, O'Brien? You wouldn't want to abandon some of the health requirements for gowns, but they're already wearing bin bags, so the idea of wearing something better that may not tick every single box is demonstrably better than a bin bag. So, no, I'll scratch that last bit from the record. Thank you so much for that, Dan. Let's talk to, should we talk to Theo Ashwood now, or should we talk to Theo Ashwood? Let's talk to him now about the new ONS figures. Theo, what is the latest, and explain, if you could, its significance to us as well.
These are the figures from the Office for National Statistics, and they are, by way of comparison to the government's daily number that they provide in terms of the number of deaths, much starker. Today they're showing, they're published every 2 weeks, today they're showing that the true coronavirus death toll could be 35% higher than those numbers from hospital deaths, which are given by the government every day. The ONS saying that 21,284 people in England died by April the 17th, with mentions of COVID-19 on their death certificates, and that's compared to the 13,917 in the government's daily toll, which they stated up to April the 17th. Now, just in terms of the total number of people dying in the week ending April the 17th, that topped at 22,000, the highest since records began in 1993, and double the number of deaths normally expected at this time of year. And there's a rising number of deaths linked to coronavirus in care homes in England and Wales, which the ONS is saying is responsible for this marked increase.
I think 7,316 registrations from care homes in the week ending 17th of April, where a normal number for that period would be about 2,400. Do we know why? And forgive me if this is a silly or an unfair question. Do we know why our daily figures don't include care homes and other deaths in the way that other countries have managed to collate?
So the government's previous responses to this question have been that it's very difficult to accurately collate that information. Hospitals, of course, come under the NHS, which is run by...
Why I asked what other countries are managing to, so it can't be that difficult.
So the government's claim, I'm just saying what their claim has been previously, is that it's very difficult for them. They're saying, ministers are saying,
yes,
to collate all that data from care homes around the country to provide an accurate daily picture. Much easier, the government say, that you just go to the NHS and you then can calculate that grim total every day in hospitals which are run by the NHS, and that's where they say there is the disparity. But of course, James, you are completely right to say that other countries have managed to do it, and so the question is...
Almost all of them.
Why can't we do it in this country?
Almost every country is managing to do that, and some of the graphs we were looking at the beginning none of us understood that we were looking at hospital-only deaths, while some of the countries they were comparing us to were looking at total deaths. Theo Ashwood, many thanks. The number may well have gone up since, but about an hour ago there were 140 NHS healthcare workers in the UK known to have died from COVID-19. We will, of course, be observing the minute's silence to honour them, and by association all of their colleagues, at 11 o'clock this morning. A quick heads up for you that is very much on the horizon, just 8 minutes away. It's true, I'm afraid, that this minister, Victoria Atkins, a safeguarding minister, did just reveal on breakfast television that she hadn't even heard of exercise sickness. This, you'll remember, is the pandemic preparation study that Dr. Philip Lee, a former Conservative MP, first brought to our attention. He was on with Sheila Fogarty on the day that he essentially sounded the alarm that this massive study undertaken in 2016, making suggestions and advice on how to prepare for a global pandemic, was there. It was consultable, and Victoria Atkins, who is the safeguarding minister, just revealed on national television that she had never heard of it, and she didn't know what it was, let alone its findings. That is the Minister for Safeguarding, presumably safeguarding the population, unaware of a massive study in 2016 delivered to government and containing advice on preparation for a global pandemic. This follows fast upon, of course, Dominic Raab in a press briefing last week or the week before. He was asked whether he'd read the exercise sickness report, and he replied that it wasn't something that springs to mind. He suggested that he would have to go away and check. Dominic Raab, of course, during his brief foray as Brexit minister, revealed that he hadn't read the Good Friday Agreement, arguably the single most important piece of legislation that is likely to be affected by our withdrawal from the European Union. But Dominic Raab hadn't read that, and as Foreign Secretary presiding over a national pandemic, he hadn't read the government's or the exercise sickness report into how to prepare for a global pandemic. It was a simulated exercise, so it wouldn't have been identical, but it would perhaps have been helpful. I'm being sarcastic. Of course it would have been bleeding helpful, just as it would have been helpful for a safeguarding minister to know that it even existed, just as it would have been helpful for the committee set up to prepare for precisely this sort of crisis to have been heeded last June when they advised that we bought a shed load of gowns. And so it continues. More of your calls on the way. Suresh is in Croydon. Suresh, what's going on?
Oh, you're right.
Yeah, I'm good, mate. How are you doing?
Sorry, I'm just exercising. Sorry if I'm a little bit out of breath.
That's all right.
It was just to come to you about
What are you doing? What exercise are you doing?
Oh, I'm just doing some pull-ups at home.
Okay.
Yeah.
Carry on. Oh, well, I feel bad now. I feel like maybe I should do some press-ups while you're talking.
Yeah,
we could pretend we were down at the gym together. It'd be the first time ever for me, Suresh, but I sense... Anyway, we're going to run out of time, so quickly. What do you want to say? My bad. Sorry.
You know your point about why the pandemic was downgraded?
Yes.
Basically, it was because of the way labs process the samples.
Right.
Basically, if you have a very...
Suresh, we're going to have to do something about this phone line, mate. I don't know whether it's linked to the fact that you're doing push-ups, but I can only hear you every other word, so possibly I can hear you when you're next to your phone, and then you pull yourself up again, and you're too far away from your phone, and I can't hear you anymore. We'll try and get back to you. Peter's in Putney. Peter, what would you like to say?
Hi, yes. Only just started listening to your programme during the shutdown, and I just wanted to say how good I find it. Intelligent conversation, very worthwhile listening to.
You're very kind, although it won't last. What would you like to contribute?
I was kind of involved back in 2009 with the pandemic flu then that never really took off. I used to work for one of the world's biggest manufacturer of disposable masks, and I was very much involved in the supply to the NHS and the training of people how to use them properly. And about 10 minutes ago, I think I heard a comment about how there was a stockpile, a very large stockpile of FFP3 masks, which are the highest.
33 million.
Yes, and I think I picked up the assumption that therefore they ought to be releasable. I think what needs to be understood about these...
No. I think the report last night was saying that a lot of them have gone AWOL and no one knows where.
I'm sorry. I thought that it was the suggestion that we had them. The thing is about them, they have a shelf life.
Right.
The filtering materials that are used electrostatically charged fibres, which makes it possible. And that makes it possible to filter the tiniest particles, half-micron-sized particles, out of the airflow. But that charge decays with time, and the usual shelf life of disposable respirators, proper respirators, not surgical masks, is 5 years. And so that was always a problem when you put in a big stockpile, unless you keep on replenishing it so that you top up the numbers.
I think you've just solved it. I think that's it, because here's the line that chilled me. The government refuses to explain where the other masks have gone. If we combine that with the 21 million missing from that 2009 procurement list with your testimony here, then clearly they've hit their sell-by date and they haven't been replaced.
Well, except that, there's one other thing. You can retest them. So, and I think I did hear about, I don't know, 2 or 3 weeks ago, that some masks, I think it might have been on one of the Downing Street briefings, that some masks have been sent back to the manufacturer to be retested.
Right. Oh, okay.
And therefore they could be relifed. But it's very unlikely, I would think, that they'd be relifed for another 5 years. They might just give them an extension.
Or indeed that there are going to be 21 million masks fitting into
Probably not. And I have been trying to research, even though I kind of ought to have known, just what the speed of decay is. There's one other point I ought to make about these masks.
Please.
The filtering efficiency of the filter materials against very, very fine particles, which is what we're talking about, the virus droplets,
exactly,
is huge. It's sort of 99.9% filtering capability. That isn't the problem. The problem is how well the mask fits on the face. And however good the filter is, if you haven't got a mask fitted correctly on your face and you breathe in, a lot of the air you breathe in goes around the sides. And that is why it's so important that these masks are fitted correctly. I've been watching on television and seeing on TV.
Peter, I'm going to pause you there because we're approaching the minute silence now, which I'm sure you'll understand takes priority. But I would look forward to talking to you again, and thank you for the kind words. It is coming up to 11 o'clock. As you know, we are going to hold a minute's silence across the UK to commemorate the key workers who have died with coronavirus. And I'll take a moment before we do that, just to add that the number as of this morning is 140, I think, and it's only going to grow. And these are people who need much more than a weekly clap on a Thursday night. These are people who need our support every single day at the moment, the workers that are still there. But now we mark the more than 100 NHS and care staff who've died with the virus, as, of course, have many transport and other key workers, where we continue to pick over, really, the unalloyed mess, or apparent success, as Boris Johnson calls it, of our government, our country's response to COVID-19. And it breaks my heart. Actually, it doesn't break my heart. It boils my blood to wonder whether they will try, as the ability to claim the Downing-Tufton Street spin machine tries to claim some sort of victory as the death toll surpasses almost every other comparable country on the planet. How long it will be before they start trying to pin this on doctors and nurses, pin it. I mean, you already had that slight suggestion from Matt Hancock, and I would really draw your attention to the word slight, because I think it was certainly possible to accuse him of this, but I don't think it was a definitive offence when he appeared to give the impression that he was accusing doctors and nurses of misusing their PPE, and that was one of the reasons why there was a shortage. You only have to think back to the doctors' strike. Think back to what newspapers like The Sun were saying about sacking them all, the militant lefties. The disgraced former editor of that newspaper, of course, Kelvin Mackenzie, talked of being prepared to come in. I found the column, don't ask why, I was researching something else. He was prepared to come in on a Sunday and sack them himself. Funny that. I wonder how we'd be coping with this if we'd sacked a bunch of doctors during their last round of deeply reluctant industrial action. And how many people hit? Do you know? Sorry, just indulge me for a minute. I got interviewed by a former editor of mine a couple of years ago at a literary festival. And at first I was a little bit offended by her inline, because I was her show business editor. And she said to me, she said, I had no idea you were political. And I said, what? How dare you? I can't even remember what the Sun called me, but anyway. And then I thought about it. She said this to me in the wings before we went onto the stage. And I thought to myself, do you know what? She's actually right. In my self-image, my personal mythology, I think I am political, because we always talked about politics at home. But I guess from 92, certainly from 97 onwards, we were on such a relatively even keel, up to and including the Iraq War. It's only retrospectively, of course, that the Iraq War is such a huge issue. But things were relatively calm. It's why I became a show business journalist, because the idea of hanging out with Norman Lamont when you could have been hanging out with Norman Cook was, to me, absolutely ridiculous. Things were on a relatively even keel, and politics was quite boring, and I wasn't very political. And I ended up entirely by accident being a talking head on programmes, because what would happen is they'd book me to talk about Liam Gallagher and Patsy Kensit's marriage, and I was quite good at that. And so I slowly evolved into someone who would also then get the call to go and sit on a breakfast television sofa and have a chat about something a little bit more political or a bit more newsy, moving away from showbiz. And then I ended up, again largely by accident, and with a big tax bill on the horizon, I ended up on LBC, working in every slot available as the company changed hands, and I didn't appear to be part of the plans of the new owners. But I got in, and I started listening to you. It's really that simple. I started listening to you, and I started looking at what my old friends and colleagues on newspapers did. And I still can't quite believe how ignorant and naive I was. The breakthrough moment for me was the industrial action taken by firefighters. And I remember reading a column, it wouldn't be fair to say by whom, but somebody who I knew, somebody who I had broken bread with in their own home, and somebody who I liked. And I read this column that was describing firefighters as if they were sort of Nazi infiltrators, well, communist infiltrators into the body politic, actual firefighters. I read this column and I listened to callers to my show and to other shows on LBC, and I saw what happened. I watched members of the public being groomed and gaslit into attacking firefighters, believing nonsense about them all having second homes in Ibiza and commuting from Barbados to do the job. And everything changed for me. Not overnight, but my old boss was right. I didn't used to be political. And then I started listening to you, for good and for ill, because I'd take call after call after call from firefighters, and I'd sit here utterly baffled about how anybody could have been so completely turned against the people that run into our house when it's on fire with the intention of carrying us and our children out. How can they ever have been our enemies? That's when I became political. Fast forward to the junior doctors' industrial action, and I wish we'd dropped the word junior from that for a whole heap of reasons. Fast forward to the doctors' strike, the non-consultant level doctors' strike, a couple of years ago, and it became even more stark that this Murdoch stroke, Mail stroke, Telegraph-led grooming process persuaded huge swathes of the British public, and I'm afraid obviously plenty of broadcasters are deeply guilty of this as well, encouraging the British public to turn on doctors. Just think about that in the context of what we just did a moment ago. The 140 healthcare workers whose death we properly commemorated, inadequately, but properly. Think about that on Thursday night when you're standing on your doorstep hitting a saucepan with a wooden spoon. Were you one of the people that used to ring LBC putting the boot into doctors and claiming they were greedy? Because you can't really do both with a clean conscience, can you? And unless they had demonised doctors so successfully, so disgustingly, I genuinely wonder whether they could have got away with this appalling depletion of PPE, absolutely highlighted put into a stark relief on Panorama last night, but very little in that programme would have come as a surprise to you if you've been listening to this programme, because the doctors and the nurses kept telling us. And then, of course, the same people that turned you against doctors during the doctors' strike, the same people that turned you against firefighters when firefighters were asking for your support as their pensions and their terms and conditions came under assault, the same people that turned you against teachers, the people into whose hands we entrust our children's lives every morning at 8:45. They became our enemies when they asked for our help in fighting some of the policies of the last 10 years. The doctors, the nurses, the firefighters, the teachers. If you got turned against all of them, then you're probably complicit in the scenario we're currently contemplating, where we're asking them to go to work ill-equipped. They're already understaffed. We know that. We know that Brexit is going to take another huge chunk out of the NHS staffing levels. And we know now, unless you're really, really clinging to it, we know now that the phrase, "we should train our own," was one of the most despicable examples of subtle racism that this country will ever see. We should train our own. How many of the dead were born elsewhere? Amazing, really, to think that they went to their graves with the words of some right-wing ghouls ringing in their ear that they should never have been here in the first place because we should have trained our own. Just think on that as you hit your saucepan with a wooden spoon on Thursday night, won't you? Because if they can pin it on the doctors and the nurses with the help of their despicable, despicable sponsors in the media, they will. And if you think I'm exaggerating or you think I'm making it up, then you are ignoring not ancient history, not even distant history. You're ignoring the last 2 or 3 years. Think what they did to the teachers. Think what they did to the firefighters. Think what they did to the doctors. And then look me in the eye and tell me that they won't try and pin this on the people who are risking everything, actually, just like every firefighter does every day, potentially, risking everything to keep the rest of us safe. Sorry, I wasn't expecting that one to come bubbling to the surface just yet, but we are where we are. Let me talk to Tom, who's in Ashford. The time now is 11:13. Tom, what would you like to say?
Oh, hello, James.
Hello, Tom.
Well, I'm ringing in as a social care worker, frontline worker, and some people would say hero, which I reject entirely. I love the job that I do. I'm looking after people with multiple learning disabilities.
Okay.
My issue from the beginning has been on the subject of wearing masks. Now, the guidance that we've been getting and that we've been having to adhere to, coming from Public Health England, you can read the document, I think it's entitled COVID-19 Working Safely in Care Homes, isn't specific enough about what kind of PPE we should be wearing, particularly masks. It seems to imply that it's discretionary for staff to wear masks.
Yeah.
And it also kind of says there's a flow chart at the very end of it on page 10, which is quite a laugh. Well, it's not. It would be.
No, I know what you mean.
You follow it down and you do no. So nobody, no staff member, no resident has shown symptoms within the last 14 days. There haven't been any visitors within the last 14 days showing symptoms. Result, infection risk extremely low, PPE not recommended. Now,
I am short of time. Give me your bombshell or your punchline if you can in a sentence.
Well, why are we sending? Why have 8,000 companies in the UK written or gone in touch with the government to supply PPE? Only, as far as I know, around about 3,000 of them have been approached. Why are they then, because they haven't had a proper response from government, sending the PPE to Spain, Germany, Italy? Why are we exporting?
There have been reports of companies who could have provided equipment to us getting no responses from the government, and therefore following the commercial imperative of needing to sell it to someone, they have sent it overseas. Off the top of my head, I don't know, or if I ever knew, I don't remember just how big a problem that was, but it was definitely a problem. And, you know, I perhaps I'm indulging in a little bit of tabloid sensationalism, but one mask that could have been in our health service, but for whatever reason wasn't, is one mask too many, isn't it? Tom, I imagine it's a tough time for you as well. I hope you're finding the time to look after yourself. You may well reject the tag hero, but you are human, and all humans need a little bit of TLC and a little bit of space sometimes. It's amazing how frazzled even people doing jobs that are not right in the face of this can become at the moment, and I do worry that behind the death figures there'll be all sorts of other issues regarding mental and physical health. It's now 11:60 where I see Lord Sugar has joined calls for the media to stop doing its job and become sort of ersatz, it's not quite the right word, is it, to become sort of cheerleaders for the government. There was do you want to know how pathetic I am? There was a thing going around on Facebook the other day. A pal of mine put it up, actually, a lad I was at school with when I was a nipper. And I had a friendly go at him, this suggestion that journalism is missing the mood of the United Country, of the Kingdom. I've explained it on Twitter this morning. It's because the vote for Brexit has become embodied by Boris Johnson. So any suggestion or suspicion that Boris Johnson is a joke, standing on the steps of Downing Street as our death toll scales unprecedented heights and talking about our apparent success, people just aren't ready to do it yet. They can't do it yet. They can't begin to think that he might be naked because they've they've invested so much of their credibility and their personal image in many ways in the idea that his robes are beautiful. So they can see his quivering buttocks, but they still have to pretend that he is clothed in magnificent robes. So someone did this Facebook thing, and I had a crack at my mate from back in Kiddie about it in a warm and friendly fashion, but I wasn't in it. It talked about a message to all of our UK negative press, including Laura Kunsberg of the BBC, Robert Peston of ITV, Beth Rigby of Sky, and Piers Morgan of ITV. And I'm so pathetic that I think I may have even tweeted, I can't believe I've been missed off this list. I feel hurt by that. Luckily, someone has doctored the original and included me in it. And Lord Sugar has just retweeted it saying, I agree with all of this. Lord Sugar unexpectedly offering up support for ideas that have been examined throughout history, and the media should stop telling the truth. Journalists should stop asking difficult questions and instead focus on optimism and faith, with less negativity and more positive support from these journalists. Wow. Can we, between us, think of, I didn't take history to degree level, I stopped at A level. Have any regimes, have any countries in the past ever experimented with the idea of not letting the media ask difficult questions, of insisting that the media offers up optimism and support for the government, however bad the government's conduct may be? I'm just trying to think off the top of my head whether there have ever been any politicians who sought to tell journalists what to do, to silence journalists. I know it's happening in Turkey at the moment, but we're nothing like Turkey, are we? North Korea might be what about historically? The idea, I suppose we could have a sort of Pravda-style news organisation where every question is run by the government in advance, and if they don't like it, you can clear off. Anyway, the answer phone king, Lord Sugar, joining calls for media to be neutered, censored and silenced. What strange times we live in. 22 minutes after 11 is the time, but thank you to whoever added me to that list of journalists. I think you possibly overestimate my importance, but as I say, I was pathetic enough to notice my absence when it first went viral. I'm going to go, crikey, there's a turn up for the books. Tim is in Ampleforth, which is where I went to school. Tim, what would you like to say?
A slight exaggeration, down the road from Ampleforth.
Easingwold?
I've just been sort of digging around over the last weeks and months. And just to say that it wasn't always so. There was an independent review of the 2009 swine flu pandemic.
Yes.
And it was described, UK was described as highly satisfactory in its response. The exceptional level of preparedness the UK has attained. And this was the World Health Organization's assessment that our preparedness was amongst the best in the world. Achieved through a substantial stockpile of drugs and sleeping contracts ready to be activated when required, plus consumables, respirators, protective equipment, and so on. Now, I've heard that there were 3,000 bids for production of PPE sitting on the Cabinet Office table waiting for action, and the companies couldn't get a response from government. I've heard of 40 companies harassing Deloitte, who apparently have taken this task on, big companies, high street names, and they've not been able to, some of which have machined up, ready to run, and they've not been able to get a response to make things like gowns. And here we are, Panorama said there were 9,000 offers from companies to make kit.
Some of which would have been, some of whom would have been, if not time wasters, then at least not fit for purpose. I mean, I think we both know that.
But, you know, let's face it, you'd
but
have
not
to
all of them.
through all of that lot, and that would be hard work. But, you know,
yes, exactly.
Time, they put in thousands of civil servants to work on that. And this was a national emergency. One of the results is that we've got unprecedented numbers of doctors and nurses dying.
And you're right, of course, the civil servants who were moved away from the kind of areas that we're discussing and put in the preparation for a no-deal Brexit departments, that has been widely reported. Do you have a medical background yourself, Tim?
I was a GP.
Right, so you know of what you speak. And
Yeah.
do you understand what a sleeping contract...
I have
sorry,
some
go on.
contacts into health provision at the moment.
Yes.
And I know that the people on the sharp end, you know, ITUs and accident and emergency and so on, are getting weary of asking and not getting, and being told, given the wrong information about what masks they can and can't have and how long they should have to wear it for. They've been bullied that if they speak to the media, they will be walked out of the gates. They'd lose their job.
Yes, I've heard that. Yes.
And they're actually starting to give up trying hard to wear the right stuff. You know, they think, oh, God, you know, here we go. Let's just get on and do it.
And that increases the risk to themselves.
Development.
Yeah, of course. Because, I mean, that's the medical thing that I don't know that lay people fully understand. I mean, it's clear in a lot of public service that idea, when it was suggested that they might stop looking after people if they didn't have the right equipment, there was a little voice in my head saying, I bet they don't. And you're kind of confirming that, aren't you?
Well, I bet they don't, but they're going to be token gestures, I suspect. I think there's
possibly.
One planned. But if you join the NHS, if you've got a passion, you want to help people, and but you expect to do that if the WHO guidelines are that you wear one of these FFP3 masks. You don't want to be told that you can just put a bit of tissue paper under your nose and off you go. And you don't want to be... I mean, you looked at Italy and China and you saw what the medics looked like there, completely invisible behind all their kit. In the UK, they're nicely on display with a little mask, no head covering, short gloves, and a pinny.
A glorified bin bag, as one ITU doctor described it to us this very morning. I don't know if he'd just come off shift. If you would, a brief response to this thing that popped up in my inbox a minute ago, because you are describing fact and reality, but Alan Sugar is suggesting that we want and need a constructive contribution to the national effort to help us out of this crisis. We need hope, optimism and faith, with less negativity and more positive support from these journalists. It is time you all changed your negative and political rhetoric for the health of this nation and started supporting our government. I wonder how you would have framed this call to my programme, Tim, if you were following Alan Sugar's advice.
I've got a very, very positive suggestion, and that's that we get cattle prods and put them behind the government to actually get on and do what they have to do, what they did in 2008-9,
yes,
and what we are very good at, which is working together, getting all those companies producing and delivering on PPE, because that's a very positive thing that we did as a country. You know, for goodness sake.
And you're right, there's the combination of...
garages.
The combination of your researches, some of my other callers who've also been looking into it, but I suppose most notably the Panorama report last night, is that 10, 11 years ago, we were ready for this. And I guess it's hard not to...
We were at the forefront in the world.
And it's hard for a Prime Minister from a party that's been in charge ever since to acknowledge just how far we've fallen in that period of time. I understand that. That's not a partisan point. That's actually just an observation of political pragmatism. You wouldn't want to stand up and say, well, it's our fault, we weren't ready, would you?
Well, it's a deliberate decision on behalf of the government in 2000. I can't get the dates.
Sure.
The government decided that they wouldn't implement the recommendations. I think it's 2016, 2017.
2016 is the sickness exercise.
The go-between between the government and the health service was Jeremy Hunt, who is now chair of the Select Committee on Health, paradoxically, and he had to go back to the NHS and said, we will not invest all that huge sum of money to build up our preparedness PPE stocks.
And he now is cast in the role of truth teller, speaking truth to power.
The NHS in his Select Committee, are we ready? And they said, yes, we are. We've got plenty in storage, 29 million of the highest spec masks. It's just a matter of distribution. You'd have thought they might have considered that any time in the last 10 years.
Forewarned is forewarned. Yes.
And so we've got all the stuff. And so everybody sort of patted each other on the back and off they went, happy that they'd done a good job.
And here we are. Tim, thank you for that. How's the Valley bearing up during these difficult times?
Oh, the Valley is wonderful. The skies are blue, clear blue. I've just been watching a bullfinch in my yard whilst I've been waiting for you to get back to me. And 5 feet away from my window, there is a goldfinch building a nest. I've been watching her build a nest. It's brilliant. Nature is really sort of having a bit of a
heyday, isn't it? It's a silver lining. I completely concur with you. Even in town, we're seeing stuff that we possibly haven't seen before, certainly haven't noticed before. Tim, thank you so much. A retired GP there, talking of the PPE, almost, I think, disappearance between 2009 and 2020. 11:30 is the time we inevitably can. Do you know, Tim, there in Ampleforth, or at least in the area up there in North Yorkshire, reminded me of something that I'm toying with the idea of doing. I'd love to know your thoughts on this. I obviously, I'm very, very sensitive to the severity of the situation in which we find ourselves, or, of course, the apparent success in which we find ourselves, as the Prime Minister chooses to put it. But I do find, well, look, I won't beat about the bush. I'm toying with the idea of asking you at some point this week what the good things are about the lockdown. I've mentioned to you a couple of things that I've found very uplifting. I thought Tim was almost lyrical there in his description of wildlife in his yard as he was waiting to come onto the radio. And I bet there's some surprises out there, things you've discovered about yourself or about your neighbourhood or about your life. And I do think, under your advisement on this one, because I don't want to misstep or make radio, because Mystery Hour's going down so well at the moment, largely because it feels like a bit of light relief. So perhaps it would be suitable to start looking at some of the things that, conscious though we are of the horrors that are still unfolding and the lives that are still being lost, whether or not the actual lockdown itself has delivered some unexpected pleasures into your life. In fact, the more I think about that, the more I think it's probably a good idea. Speaking of good ideas, here's one for the pub quiz. Which American state already has universal basic income? You'll remember that the idea of every citizen receiving money from the government every year as a sort of baseline of economic activity is roundly and routinely dismissed in some quarters as a sort of form of communism or weaponized idealism. Obviously, the quarters that routinely dismiss and denigrate it are usually secretly funded by incredibly rich people whose identity is never disclosed by the shills and ghouls who turn up on telly and radio all the time talking about why it would be an appalling idea. I oversimplify slightly, but I do this for a living, and I was staggered to discover the other day that Alaska already has a form of universal basic income and has done for some years. The more, how can I put this? I just find myself wondering whether actually it is going to be one of those things that in our lifetime assumes a completely different weight and reputation to the one that it currently has, and indeed whether or not we may see it introduced in our lifetime. There are movements afoot in some parts even of this country to make it so. Johnny Ross Tatum is from the Universal Basic Income Lab Network, and it's hard to know where to start, Johnny. Thank you for your time. But I suppose I'd like to know how plausible you think it is that you could see it introduced in your lifetime, and perhaps also a little bit on why my mum's hometown of Sheffield is something of a standard bearer in this area.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me on the show. I mean, you mentioned Alaska already have a universal basic income, and in this country, we already have universal services like the NHS, which guarantees healthcare for all. We have the basic state pension, which guarantees at least some financial security for all pensioners. So universal basic income would be an extension of that to guarantee a basic level of financial security for everybody. And importantly, meaning that nobody would have to rely on a food bank to eat or become homeless because they can't pay their rent. It will be a raise in incomes for millions of lower and middle income households, many of whom are only one unexpected payment away from debt. And trials around the world have shown that it works, that it significantly improves mental health and physical health. And by putting money into people's hands, it will not only bring that financial security, but also that vital economic boost to communities across the country, like those that have been hit hard by austerity, which was crucial before, but is particularly important as we enter a recovery. So the idea has gained traction very much so because the crisis has shown the financial insecurity that was already widespread in society. And we realised that we need to try something different, not just to recover from this crisis, but to have a new and fairer settlement going forward.
Yeah, and I mean, indeed, it is your network, your lab is looking at the response to coronavirus and trying to build political support for some sort of emergency UBI. When you say it's gaining traction, obviously part of me has to say to you, well, you would say that, wouldn't you? So where's the evidence of the traction that's been gained?
Well, yeah, of course, but on many different levels. As you said earlier, there's a lot of movement for this at a grassroots level, particularly in the north and places like Sheffield, but across the country, because we want a better future with more financial security, and we're not just going to wait for Westminster to hand down solutions to us. But we are delighted that MPs and politicians across the country are listening to these calls. So just last week, I believe, over 100 MPs and peers put forward a case for having a universal basic income to support us during our recovery. And we have support from politicians across all parties, including one MP in the Conservative Party. So this idea, Sir Edward Lee, came out publicly in support of this.
Well, that surprises me. Carry on.
Well, perhaps it does, but he said it's the most simple and effective way of getting support to everybody so that nobody falls through the cracks, which is so important at this time, but it's important at all times. So there is growing traction across this country and around the world for it.
And what would it look like in the context of Britain at this time, if you see what I mean?
So there's definitely a case for a short-term, high-level universal basic income to stimulate the economic recovery, to put money in people's hands so we can start spending in local businesses. But over the long term, you're looking at a permanent universal basic income of somewhere around £100 a week for every adult, £50 a week for every child. There are proposals that are more modest than that, and there are proposals that are more ambitious. But that still provides a baseline, as you said, a baseline of economic security for everyone that people can move up from.
I've seen this reported, elements of your work reported in the FT and indeed in the Yorkshire Post. The proposal that you've got in place now, this guarantee of some form of security for everybody, is most routinely criticised by people like me, I suppose, saying, well, I don't need it. What a waste of money it would be. How do you counter that obvious but not necessarily irrelevant criticism?
Yes, I mean, I get people to think about the NHS and the basic state pension. When you have a payment or service to everybody, it means that everybody who needs it gets it. And those who are higher earners, who perhaps don't need it, will essentially pay it back in tax. The problem we have with very well-meaning targeted benefits So when the government says we only want to support benefits that target those who need it, that's very well-meaning and understandable. But often with those, they're very bureaucratic, they're very complicated. They miss out millions of people who do need it because of that complicated process. And there are often crude cut-off points where people who could really do with the support are decided to be not eligible for it. So when you have universal payments that everyone gets, everybody gets the support, everybody buys into it, and higher earners will pay it back in tax. It's a fair and effective way of guaranteeing support for everybody.
£1,000 per adult, £500 per child. So you've sent me reeling off mentally, actually, Johnny. I'm trying to wonder what else Bernie Sanders and Sir Edward Lee might agree on in the context of broader political questions. We do need to find out. But I mean, the reason we're talking is because you've published a report into this. How can people read it and find out more about it?
So first of all, I'd very much encourage people, if they're interested in this idea, to look up the UBI Lab network, perhaps join a local group. There are many across the country, or set up your own, and we can support that. But there are many different groups and organisations proposing universal basic income across the country, and we're just one of them. So our report was very much based on a short-term stimulus after the recovery.
Yes.
So when you're talking about the £1,000 per month, that is a very high level, but that's the kind of thing that we need to prevent a deep recession. I mean,
it's not a million. Sorry to interrupt you, but it's not a million miles away from some of what Rishi Sunak's doing for people in work, is it? I mean, this idea that the government will ensure the security, the financial security of the nation by ensuring the financial security of individuals. You could make a case for bridging those two phenomena, couldn't you? Quite easily, I imagine you have.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. And the government's proposals have been welcomed. But the problem is that still millions of people are falling through the cracks of those and not getting support. A universal basic income is a very simple, as Sir Edward Lee said, a very simple and effective way of putting money into people's hands. It means nobody misses out, and we can't afford anyone to miss out at this time and at all times. But when we need to stimulate our recovery, people need to have money in their hands that they can pay into the local economy to support small businesses, which are the backbone of our communities and our economy. And an ambitious proposal for something like this will be necessary. In the long term, a universal basic income should be the foundation of a decent social security system that has been shown to be lacking in this crisis.
Finally, the city of Hull, which is something of I mean, it's a very innovative city in many, many ways, which is no doubt why it largely gets ignored by London-based media. They're at the forefront of this, aren't they? They're hoping to run a trial this year, I think, or next year. What's the latest on that?
They are. Hull is a great city, and there's fantastic campaigners there, including some of the local councillors. And what's happening is local councils in the north, but also in Scotland, and local communities are saying, we want this change, we want this idea to be at least considered. And so Hull City Council passed a motion saying they want to have a basic income at least tried in Hull, and so have Sheffield, so have Liverpool, and 4 local councils in Scotland. And we're likely to see more local communities, more local councils joining Hull in saying, do you know what, the current way we're doing things isn't working. We need to try universal basic income and put pressure on Westminster and the government to listen.
So, again, if people want to find out more, just Google UBI Lab Network and take it from there. I know you're based in Leeds. A lot of this is coming out of Yorkshire, but as you say, it's spreading across the nation.
Exactly. We have 13 different groups across the country, and there's many more being set up all the time. So if you find out if there's a local group that you can join and you can be part of, but also if there's no local group where you are, we will support you in setting up your own.
Great stuff. That's really interesting, actually. Thank you so much. Johnny Ross-Tatum from the UBI Lab Network, giving us a little more understanding of and insight into something that I think, and clearly lots of other people do increasingly, including, remarkably, well, I don't know why I keep saying remarkably, including Sir Edward Lee, we're going to be hearing a lot more about it in the coming months and years. In old money, and speaking of old money, I'm toying with the... Didn't we do it relatively recently? I'm not making light of anybody's plight. You know I'm not. But there is an old adage in this industry, in this game. I think I heard it first from the legend that is Clive Bull. When people labour under the illusion that the hardest part of this job is making the phones ring, you point out to them it's actually really, really easy to make the phones ring, and the easiest way to do it historically is to say, is there anybody old out there feeling poorly? Even, of course, to make it even easier, is there anybody out there feeling poorly? I'm going to do a variation upon that in the next hour, but for reasons that are not only easy to understand, but are also rather important, and make a mockery of the mockery that I've just been indulging in. Because I just want to know, again, firsthand, or anecdotally, if you prefer, about the knock-on effects. Clearly, the achievement that the government is going to try to claim from its appalling mismanagement of this crisis is going to be the fact that the NHS coped. There were, after 10 years of swinging cuts and resignations, people leaving the health service in unprecedented numbers, there were many fears across the country that the NHS would buckle under the pressure, underfunded, under-resourced, understaffed, and it hasn't, which is good, or at least it's an almighty relief. But of course the reason why that has happened is because so many other areas of the National Health Service have been essentially shut down so that capacity could be shifted to coping with COVID-19. Some of that is formal and official, some of that is policy, health trust and political policy. Some of it is actually just down to you and me not knowing what we're supposed to do if we're feeling poorly at the moment, not presenting. So in the final hour of the programme today, we will look at health, the impact of COVID-19 on other health issues. So some of the numbers involving cancer, Professor Carol Sikora has been very outspoken in calling for attention on those areas. I think one of our callers last week mentioned it as well. What's not happening in the context of your healthcare because of the COVID-19 crisis? And this is simply an exercise in collecting data, collecting stories. There's no other way it could have been done on this one, I don't think, because the NHS was so severely diluted by Jeremy Hunt and others. They had no choice. The way to cope with this, I think, and I'm no expert, was to do what they've done. So there's actually no explicit criticism involved in saying what's happened to you as a result of COVID-19, but not because you've got COVID-19. I don't need to labour that point. It's very easy to understand. So we'll get on to that, I think, after 12. If you want to squeeze in a call regarding just I think we now know how this has happened. So in 2009, we had loads of PPE. We were really well equipped for it. The reports were sent to government telling us how much we had. And in 2020, it turned out that we had enormous shortages about which the government has been, if not dishonest, then deeply, deeply disingenuous. And there's no mystery here anymore. But the question of whether or not they're getting it sorted now is one that we've addressed this morning, and we haven't really liked the answers, have we? I don't think. Because it seems that, well, our very first caller, doctor, currently redeployed, I think, in ITU, describing himself as going to work in a bin bag. 11:52 is the time. Tom is in Preston. Tom, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi, James. Yeah, just a quick one before I make my main point. We actually had to deliver some PPE to my husband's friend who's on ICU. I won't go into details how horrific her job is every single day at the moment. Yes. Ill-prepared with the wrong PPE, the wrong aprons. So thankfully we had some we could share. She did actually have a word with management and said, if she gets this virus from here, then she will be suing the trust. They said to her, you'll have to prove you got it from here, which is a horrendous thing to say to somebody who is... I
don't fully understand, forgive me.
So she works in ICU, yeah?
Yes. No, I know what that means.
Yeah, so the PPE that they were told initially wasn't suitable is now suitable, so they're telling them to wear the stuff that they said wasn't enough, but now they're running out, they're telling them that it's okay. So she said that if she gets the virus from work due to lack of PPE, then she will sue the trust, and the trust said, you'll have to prove that you got it from here.
Oh, I see what you mean. And that would be impossible to do because they could simply say you could have got it from anywhere. Exactly. Well, I mean, she's not here, and I'm always a little bit wary of. I'm not questioning your honesty, but it's concerning, but it's not, if you like, definitive, is it? What was the central point you wanted to make?
The main point was my husband was finally fitted for a FFP3 mask about 2 weeks ago. A little too late. We'd both had the virus by then. And then they just happened to look at the date on the mask, and it had 2020, but when he scraped the sticker off, it was actually dated 2015.
No, but gosh, I love it when this happens. We've had a call about this earlier, and they can be I can't remember what word the doctor who rang in used, or was it? No, it was Peter, wasn't it, who used to work in procurement. And although they have shelf lives and out of date, they have sell-by dates, they can be sent back to the manufacturer and repurposed.
But would it not make more sense then to completely remove the old date, because it's not going to fill...
Not necessarily, not if they know what's happened. My
husband didn't know.
It's an odd argument to have. I mean, if it was originally out of date in 2015, it gets sent back to the manufacturer and it then has 5 more years of life on it, then, I mean, it should have been explained to your husband, and it is deeply concerning that it wasn't, but it's not necessarily the smoking gun that perhaps you thought it was. Not necessarily. I mean, it might be, but you seem to be suspicious that it's some sort of con that's gone on.
I'm suspicious that it's some sort of con, because we've been con from the start with this government, because everything they've been saying is lies.
You're putting me in a position where I'm sort of defending them. I'm not defending the government in any way, shape or form, and any journalist who has essentially abandoned their role in public life, but I am giving you an explanation of what could have happened there that wouldn't be either cock-up or conspiracy.
Yeah, I take that on board, but I just think it should be explained, and also if they've been retested, then the old date should be removed, because it doesn't fill the staff who are going out on the front line with confidence if they're using...
No, I'm not arguing with you. It's one or the other, isn't it? They should either have explained it or they should have removed it. If they've done neither, then you have little option but to at least be suspicious, if not leaping to conclusions of conspiracy. Then you're perfectly entitled to be suspicious, especially when stuff emerges, as of course it has done regarding gloves. I said it on air as a joke, Tom. I said they're probably counting individual gloves as individual items of PPE. I said it as a joke on air.
Yeah, well, it's probably true, to be fair. Because,
it's not probably true. It is true.
Well, I'm seeing all kinds. I'm seeing all kinds for a lot of it, and then you see Hancock saying they've been in the care homes from day one. They haven't, and they're still not, because he works in them. So it's all lies.
Well, lies, damned lies, and statistics. I don't know why I said that. It's not even very appropriate for the moment. Thank you for the call. Good luck to your husband. Sorry to hear about his friend's situation. The 60,000 payout that the families of dead healthcare workers are going to get does not involve any inability subsequently to take legal action against their employer if they do feel, or if the families feel, that their loved one was put at unnecessary risk. I put that out there. That's quite a relief. That's good news. The 60,000 compensation is good news of sorts as well, although the BMA is concerned that it doesn't replace, the income over a lifetime that healthcare worker would have brought into a family. It's £60,000 better than nothing. I hope that doesn't sound too crass. And astonishingly, I don't know if you heard this, but the son of a doctor who died after sending a letter to the government warning of a shortage of PPE said this morning that he thinks the money would be better spent on buying PPE for medical staff. It was one of those moments where the radio sometimes reaches out, doesn't it, and slaps you around the chops. I couldn't quite believe my ears. Mourning for his father, angry with government. He phoned Matt Hancock on Nick's show as well today. So angry with the government, mourning his father, wondering why they didn't act upon his late dad's letter, warning what was going to happen. His dad then died, and the £60,000 compensation to which that family is entitled, he suggested, would have been better spent on PPE. I mean, there'll be an element of his family's own financial security involved, I imagine, in that observation, but there was a selflessness to it that really amazed me. It's coming up to 11:59. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. In the next hour, maybe a couple more calls in this field, but we will generally be turning attention to other areas of medical care that have been impacted by COVID-19 but are not about COVID-19. I don't know why I'm so concerned about making this clear. I'm pretty sure you can understand me already, but the central point is, if COVID-19, if this crisis hadn't hit, then X would have happened to you, and it's not happening to you because of COVID-19. Oddly, we took a call last week from a fella with appalling toothache, and at the beginning of the call I was thinking, why have they put this fella on? But I soon realised why, because I don't know if you ever had really chronic toothache. It's hell. Compared to being on a ventilator with double pneumonia, it's not hell, but it flipping hurts. And if you are indefinitely now wondering when you're going to get treatment that you need, I just want to hear from you. Partly, as often on the programme during this curious period of our shared history, partly because I sense sometimes people just feel a little bit better after they've vented, after they've shared. You know what they say about problems? Shared is halved, so I'll take half.